It is such a delight to have this conversation here today, and it's going to be a conversation. We're going to get it started here for a little while, and then we're going to involve all of you in different ways, including our Aspen Poets. And the title of our session here today with these two remarkable poets. I mean, I just, it happens at the Aspen Ideas Festival that you kind of pinch yourself and you're walking along and suddenly you're in the company of remarkable people. But you should be pinching yourselves or slap your neighbor in the face and wake up and say, this is not a dream. To have a conversation about the topic of race, justice, alienation, citizenship, and art with these two poets, really two of the luminaries of our time, using the word to make sense of our time. And, it's kind of, we couldn't have planned it, but here we sit after a pretty intense couple of weeks in America. And a couple of weeks that have been filled with pain and alienation and bloodshed. A couple of weeks that have been filled with redemption and joy and relief. And what's been remarkable about all of what's happened, whether it's the tragedy in Charleston and the aftermath, the arguments about the Confederacy and its flag, the Supreme Court decision on marriage equality, all throughout, you touch each one of these touchstones of the last couple of weeks, and you realize the role that art has had in every one of these things. Art, imagery, poetry, the word, and the symbols that we use. And I guess I wanted to begin with both of you with a single question for you each to answer, and then we're going to just be a bit more free form. But the most basic question for both of you is, how in your work, in the way that you work, do you make sense of a moment like the one that we're going through right now? What is the way that you take in all of the pain and beauty and contradiction of this time? And when does that and how does that get converted into the kinds of works that you both create?
A little question. I have a few thoughts to begin. I think that one of the things that's very important in writing poetry, one of the things that I think sometimes separates a successful poem from a less successful poem, is that on the one hand, you're making patterns, you're creating felicity, you're trying to make a certain kind of harmony, you're trying to make a certain kind of music. But I think also the will to tidy up, when you see that imposed on a poem, when you see, a couplet that shuts things down too neatly, that doesn't remind us that there is irresolution in the world as well, and that a work of art can open questions even as it gives us the sort of feeling of aesthetic satisfaction and fullness. Holding contradiction, I think, is something that poetry can actually do very, very well, and that perhaps is what marks poetry that is very, very dynamic. I think that, and I said this earlier today, I think of what poets are supposed to do is go around with antenna, go around like a radio tower, pick up the signals, take it in, and not take it in any form of language that exists already. Take in the sounds, take in the shapes, take in the viscera, take in the phrases, and then make something of it. That's sort of what we do. And to add to that, for myself, and I think in Claudia's work as well, having an understanding of history. I have often turned to historical moments because I think that the only way that we can understand the horror of right now is historically, even if we haven't gotten it all the way figured out. I think what we see in Citizen is a very, very powerful history of the present tense, understanding the historicity of this moment with all that is brought to it. So I think some kind of understanding of history is something that poets can bring to bear on the present.
I'm going to come back to that in a moment and just note that among the collections of poetry that Elizabeth has published, one which I guess is a kind of a compilation, Crave Radiance, is itself one I would commend to you precisely because it cuts across history and shifts in time and juxtaposes past and present in ways that illuminate both. But we'll come back to that. Claudia, in terms of how do you make sense of a moment like this?
Well, I don't make sense of it. I think that as it's happening, I am watching, I'm listening, I'm distressed, I'm pissed off, I'm many things. And I rarely ever write in this state because the time is so alive to it, and alive in all the emotions that are available to it. I was thinking, as Elizabeth was speaking, that her memoir is about mourning. And one of the things that you do in that book is to move through the various ways in which one moves through mourning. And I think that is what we as a country have been doing in the last few weeks and will continue to do. So, I think that for me, poetry, and the reason why I will be a poet for the rest of my life, it's the sacred space for emotions. And even though the history comes in, the facts come in, the moments are interrogated, it is a special place where emotions also stand equal to facts. And in the realm of the poem, we can feel our full feelings. And it doesn't have to present as nonpartisan or distant in any way. And so that, I feel like that, for me, is why the lyric and the poem becomes the scene to interrogate what is our lives.
Also, I just wanted to add on too. I wonder what you think about this. If poetry is also a space of return, or a space to which we return, and that I think that sometimes maybe we read a poem once and we move on, but I think the invitation is come back to it. How does it shift? What didn't I see the first time? And I think that practice is a practice that we don't have as much of as we need in thinking our way through these very, very, very fraught
Do you
public
mean this
moments.
both as writer and reader, or are you speaking?
I mean this. No, I think that when any of us, myself included, as when I come to a poem, I feel that in a good poem, I'm going to come back to it, and I'm going to turn it over, and I'm going to see, and I'm going to contemplate, and it might be useful to me in one way today, and in another way in a week. That practice of return and contemplation is something that I think there's not enough of in the kind of mainstream examination of moments of trauma. People said they forgive Dylan Roof, on we go. Well, no. We got to come back to that. What is that moment? What does that mean? How do we sit with that? How do we turn it over? And I think that is a poetry reading practice.
The book of Elizabeth's that Claudia mentioned is a book not of poetry but of prose, a memoir recently published called The Light of the World. And when Claudia said it was a book of mourning, it is a book reckoning with the sudden death of your husband, and reckoning with grief, but also making full sense of the love. And I guess this notion of mourning and trauma that our country is in right now, and that impulse to want to too quickly tidy up, as you said, right? Oh, it was the relatives of those killed forgive, and so let's put a bow on that and kind of and remark upon what a healing nation we are, and so forth. What have you learned in the course of doing this exquisite work of writing and sharing your experience of mourning and grief about how you now try to live as a citizen when we as a culture are having such a bad time, doing such a bad job of facing true mourning, truth and reconciliation?
Another big question. I mean, I think that, which is a good thing. I think one of the things I've learned in writing about love, and writing about love that starts with two people, and we all love to be in love, and we love that feeling, and sometimes that feeling leads to more, and that is a beautiful thing. So it is a love story, but I think that love between two people, if it does not radiate outward, if it doesn't radiate outward to kids, not to kids, but to community and out and out and out. My husband was a painter. We were both making art that we hoped would radiate out and out and out. It's a hoarded resource. If we look at love as being satisfied in its, in action between two people. So, I mean, that sort of seems like a roundabout way, but that's one of the deepest things actually that I've learned about citizenship, is that, anything that is well written can be exemplary to others, right? I mean, good writing, I read it, I'm moved, I connect to it. But a love story and the measure of that loss has to have a wider meaning, and that the way to give it that meaning, I think, is to start exactly with what you know. So that only begins to get to your question, but that's the kind of what I learned.
Yeah, and we'll return to it in different ways. Claudia, when you and I last saw each other, we had a conversation, a public conversation that had followed a similar discussion on stage with some young people from Ferguson, activists who had been really engaged in organizing, really engaged in the aftermath of all that's gone on there, of activating their peers and their neighbors. And what struck me as Elizabeth was talking, actually as both of you talked, about seeing patterns, about having these antennae, about being in a space that actually where emotion is of equal currency value as facts. Mm-hmm. Actually, all those three things are true of politics too, right? Politics is about making sense of patterns of the chaos and telling a story about, what it is that's actually happening. Politics is about, good politicians have that antennae, right? And I don't mean just elected officials, I mean good organizers even, right? They're listening to where people are around them. And certainly that space of emotion, equal or trumping fact. When you think about how others today, particularly younger people, are hearing and reading and experiencing your work, does it make you want to add anything, like kind of go back and say, oh, okay, I wrote this before what's happened here in Ferguson or Charleston, whatever. If I could rewrite that, I would change it this way. I would retune it this way because my antennae are picking up something different. Or would you just let it sit and let people interpret it as the light will allow them to in that time?
I think that goes back to what Elizabeth was saying, that I feel if you do what you're doing in a way that speaks to the core of the thing and not the thing itself, it will expand and contract as it needs to. So my hope is that Citizen is a breathing text, and that it doesn't need to be updated in the sense of the specific moments, because they are moving out of the same structural dynamics in terms of the ingrained racism in this country. And whether it's Charleston today or Michael Brown last summer or Emmett Till, the dynamics are similar, and the response again and again is one of grief, one of mourning, one of a call to action. I love what Black Lives Matter has done in terms of asking people to come out on the streets without an agenda, without saying we need to change this, or you just need to come out and say this is wrong. And in that sense, I feel like that movement is also a fluid and breathing movement, started by those three women activists. So I guess the answer to your question is no. Mm-hmm. I don't think I need to go back in. I need to do something else, yes. Mm-hmm. Yesterday I was at the Antigone. How many people are at the Antigone session? And as he was talking about the dynamics of Antigone, I was thinking, somebody needs to, like me maybe, I don't know. Somebody needs to write about Ismene, and how perhaps the desire not to interfere is its own kind of activism. That let the body stay out there. Let everybody have to negotiate the dead body. Let that be part of the day-to-day, rather than Antigone's move to have it buried. So it's that, so those kinds of things come
Even
up.
what you just said, somebody needs to, like me maybe, right? Is such a great distillation of what Damien's trying to do with this program in general about the notion of the citizen artist. The citizen as artist, the artist as citizen, in the sense that maybe nobody else is actually going to try to either make sense or describe the nonsense of this moment, and maybe I ought to, right? Why not me, to put it another way? When we had a kind of preparatory phone call a couple weeks back, we were playing a little bit with the title that we've been given for this session, and particularly the word alienation. When Damien and I had first started talking about this topic and thinking about how much pain there is around dynamics of race in this country. And I'm not just talking about the pain of those close to the folks killed in Charleston, or close to, the family of Jordan Davis is here on campus with us this week. I'm not just talking about that. It takes maybe a moment of empathetic imagination, but Dylan Roof was clearly someone feeling the pain and absorbing in his own way the pain of what he'd been told he was supposed to be. Somewhere along, he picked up a notion of what he was supposed to be and how that was to be defined as against what other people he thought were, right? And this notion of alienation, I guess I would love to hear both of you explore it a bit more. When we had that phone call, so much, if you haven't read Citizen yet, it is this mesmerizing, textured depiction of an accumulation of small moments of alienation, sometimes punctuated by large moments of alienation and racism, but just this steady, dripping accumulation. The poems that I've read of Elizabeth's in Crave Radiance are, and you spoke to this when we had our conversation, less about the alienation per se, perhaps, and more the word that you used was resilience, and thinking about, not in a tidying up way, but in a way of thinking about there's a similarly long tradition in the United States when we think about our failures to reckon with race, a similarly long tradition of resilience that sits right alongside the long experience of alienation. So it's been a couple weeks since we first had that. What are your thoughts now on alienation, race, and justice, and the ways that you think about even that idea that Damien has teed up for us?
Okay. I was hoping you would start only because I remembered you said something brilliant.
Well, I'm pushing against it.
Okay.
Still, several weeks later.
Okay. What was it? Tell me again.
I think, an important rubric, but I think I don't understand, I wish I could understand Dylan Roof as alienated. I understand him as mentally ill and as a trained racist killer. That's not alienated. He's not the only one. He has ideology. He has learning. It's perverse learning. You read, he read the slave narratives. What? Which prove to us that slavery actually wasn't. So, it's cuckoo, right? But it is a syllabus. This man had a syllabus that he used, and he did not make it by himself. Other people have that syllabus. How do we contend with that? Who took his picture with the flags and the this and with the guns and the What about the people he told about what he was in community? So I think that's something that's much more terrifying to contend with. I think that to the question of alienation and thinking about Black people and Black tradition, which we talked about, and that's where we came to this. My other thought was, well, if African Americans were alienated across history, even in a country that hasn't always made space for us, we would not actually be here, right? I mean, that to me, the more powerful story, and as we've been talking about, not the tidy story, but the powerful story is, what is that resilience that ties people together? And again, we were, right, it was Charleston, we were right in it when we spoke on the phone. And I was looking at all of those images in the media of black men holding each other and weeping, and thinking, how does that press against the narrative we're fed every day about black men, right? Do we ever, if we see black people mourning, we see black women falling out and doing the bodily work of mourning, but do we see black men in that space? So, I mean, those moments, actually, those visual moments of people coming together and mourning in a community, circles of black men really, really stuck with me and felt to me like they gave us something to think about looking back to today.
Mm-hmm.
Well, when Elizabeth said that, I thought, that is exactly right. And it made me think, in Citizen, I wrote about Darrell Dedman, who was also a white guy from the South, who, with a group of friends, went driving around looking for black people to beat up and kill. And you might remember he was imprisoned because the James Craig Anderson stepped out of his hotel early in the morning. The two cars drove up. They beat him. He's crawling on the asphalt, and Dedman in his pickup truck drives over him. And then they all meet at the McDonald's. And while he's at the McDonald's, everything is being recorded, and he says, "I ran that nigger over." And so that's why he was initially taken by the police. So for me, Dedman is not that far from Roof. They are being brought up by families who are nurturing these ideas inside of them. And somehow, there's a lot of talk about devastation in the black community, but I'm wondering about, these guys, they're 18, 17, 19. Mm-hmm. What and who do they think they're achieving by killing black people? What kind of alienation is inside them that they feel that to actualize themselves, they need to track down black folks and shoot a church full or run them over with their car? What is that? And so I was thinking a lot that actually we need to be a little bit concerned. This idea that you just label them as insane. Roof was one guy. In Dedman's case, there were 2 carloads. Not all of them were insane. And similarly, they had tracked these people. So if it's insane, it's a very disciplined insanity. Mm-hmm. The other thing to think about is that when Obama was elected, in Springfield, Massachusetts, the black church there was burned to the ground. So not in the South, in Springfield, Massachusetts, as an answer to our black president. 3 men, all of them indicted. So it's not, again, it's the culture showing that this is the response to black bodies. Take away the sacred spaces and kill them. It's our culture. We're building this.
One of the things that when Claudia and I spoke a while back, even months ago, and you were even then playing with Antigone and thinking about what you've just spoken to, the notion of black bodies, of bodies. of the resonance of bodies, right? And so much of what I had the opportunity earlier this afternoon to sit in a little bit on a session that Elizabeth was doing with our young Aspen poets, and Claudia did a similar session yesterday. And there's, of course, one role that poetry plays, and the way that you were interacting with these young poets really illuminated that, which is poetry, as you've both said, can tell that story of the body and force us to confront it in a lot of different ways, right? That the rest of our culture or politics isn't asking us to do. But I think that the other question that I have for you when you think about a moment like this is, I know that one of the exercises you asked the young poets to do yesterday was to invite them to write as if white, to write from a white perspective. I'm curious, first of all, because I didn't witness this, what led you to think of or to decide to bring in this exercise? And what is it that you could imagine that kind of exercise, not just with a group of already expert crafters of language, but with just everyday citizens? What an invitation like that to flip perspective would be intended to do? What would you mean to do by asking people to do that?
Well, one of the things that's interesting to me, sort of just blindly, do you remember everybody sat in a segregated way? So every
That's all we were talking about.
You were mixed up today, yeah. It
Well,
was
I'm
a
glad.
veritable rainbow.
But that sense that if we are not conscious about how we construct societies around race, then we will construct what was unconsciously constructed. And also the other thing is that often it's seen as a black problem. It's a black problem, it's a black burden, it's a black grief, it's a black death. But it wouldn't be happening without white bodies in the room. So what is that whiteness? What is white privilege? What is white anxiety? What is white defensiveness? What is white discomfort? What is all of that? Perhaps if we began to talk about those things and think about those things, then two bodies would arrive. And only when we have the two bodies together can we move forward. So I think that sense of moving it over into a problem that belongs to the black community erases white culpability. And consequently, white people can be sad about what happened in Charleston and then go back to their lives and consider their lives normal life. If they were able to hold these problems as American problems, then they couldn't move away from them in the way that black bodies can't move away from them. So I think we need to begin to shift the gaze. We need to think about Dylann Roof. What's up? What up with Dylann Roof? Who made that? How, his life is over, as it should be, because of what he did. But the minute before he did what he did, who could have stepped in, as you said? Because that's a life too. And so I just think we need to start looking at both sides of this thing.
Well, I mean, so truthfully and powerfully put, and I think that also without sidetracking us to a conversation about Rachel Dolezal, because we could be here.
It's pretty good that it took 37 minutes. So.
No, but here's what I want to say about that that's been frustrating to me about that whole conversation. And this is about what is whiteness, right? I mean, it is a profound form of white privilege to try to borrow black authenticity. I mean, that's white privilege right there. And what I think we didn't get to talk about that I find so compelling and so important is, what about white allies?
Right.
What about the white woman who's a white woman who works at the NAACP? What about the white woman who's a white woman who has black children and raises them, you know, in a beautiful and conscious way? I mean, those people exist.
Exactly.
And so that, I think, is also part of, you know, what are all the bodies in the room and how are they in the room and what does it mean to be able simply to say, I am a white person.
Exactly. I mean, if we start talking about white people, we'll understand that there are actually white mothers of black children who are going through the same kind of distress around having black sons out in a militarized police zone. So, you know, but we can't get there, we can't get to her if we're not looking at white bodies and thinking about constructions of whiteness. And you know, this sense, earlier today I was talking to the mayor, they had a really great, the mayor of New Orleans, and he was saying, you know, I felt a little attacked, and I said, you know, it's okay to be uncomfortable. This idea that white people cannot be uncomfortable, that it's not, you know, that means that they're under attack. It doesn't mean you're under attack, it means you're uncomfortable.
Yeah.
That's all it means. And if we're not used to talking about race, everybody's going to be uncomfortable.
And you won't die from it.
And you're not going to die from it. Yeah.
So Elizabeth, you know, you're, I'm thinking about one set of poems in particular in Crave Radiance, and I forget which prior book it had come from, but it's a series of poems about the Amistad.
Yes, from American Sublime.
Yes. Will you just describe a bit what that series of poems is and why you chose to write it and the way you chose to write it? Because it in different ways, it illuminates parts of what you both have been saying here. And it unpacks a lot of presumptions about whose voice and through whose eyes justice in that case was being understood and interpreted. Just say a word about it.
Well, I wanted to, living as I did for many years in New Haven, Connecticut, I thought about the Amistad story, the Amistad captives. You know, when my first child was a baby, we'd walk across the green and I would want to know, I would look and see that's where they were held in the jail. This is where they came out for exercise. You know, I'm always trying to think, and I think for you poets, the exercise of thinking about what happened on the ground on which I walk. Right? What happened here? What happened here? Do we know what happened here in Aspen? I don't know. but you need to know where you walk. And I think that can always be a very, very rich source of work. And so, you know, I found that the tale that we know of this mutiny of these illegally transported Africans, who everyone calls slaves, and they were never slaves, though people were attempting to bring them into slavery, the rebellion of Sankey, who we know about, that story hadn't been, and I'm going to read one little tiny snippet. Oh, but I'll come apart, won't I?
It's okay, take it off and you can just hold it after that.
Okay. Because I think that to read a little bit is what does a better job.
Yep.
So I just thought, as I often do, where did the bag go? It was here just a minute ago. I'm sorry, I'm disrupting the panel. I'll put the thing back on. Oh, okay, that was just a little just thinking about what would it mean as a poet to be able to imagine some of these voices in history that we hadn't had a chance to know about. Is that why you were asking? I was thinking about, it occurred to me that there were no women on that ship. that there were children and there were grown men and there were no women. So this is just one small section from that poem. Absence. In the absence of women on board, when the ship reached the point where no landmass was visible in any direction, and the funk had begun to accrue. Human funk, spirit funk, soul funk, who commenced the moaning? Who first hummed that deep sound from empty bowels, roiling stomachs, from back of the frantically thumping heart? In the absence of women, of mothers, who found the note that would soon be called blue, the first blue note, from one bowel, one throat, joined by dark others in gnarled harmony? Before the head rag, the cast iron skillet, new blue awaited on the other shore, invisible, as yet unhummed. Who knew what note to hit or how? In the middle of the ocean, in the absence of women, there is no deeper deep, no bluer blue. So I'm not sure if that's why you were asking, but I mean, I think that also in thinking about, and this goes back to resilience and survival and the art forms and cultural forms that have carried people forward. And you know, that was what we saw invoked when the president sang Amazing Grace and lifted us up. It was not even so much about that song per se. It was about turning to the depths of communal song as a way not of saying everything's going to be all right, because he didn't, but rather of saying this is how we come together and try to get over, you know, to quote another gospel song, to get over to what is inevitably the next challenge ahead, but collectively, in collective voice.
And this is what is so powerful about the poems of both of our panelists, is that they illuminate that possibility without, again, it being too neat or tidy or meant to make anybody feel like, you know, great at the end of the show, right? And you know, the question that you posed in unpacking how and why you wrote that series of poems, what happened here? Some of you got a chance last night to see JR's presentation about his work, and if you didn't, he showed some slides of an installation he's created at Ellis Island, where he has, and JR, if you don't know, is a street artist who creates massive, larger-than-life portraiture and pastes it everywhere, on the sides of buildings, on plazas, where, you know, wherever it might be. And he got permission to go to Ellis Island and go to parts of Ellis Island where he had seen old photographs of immigrants there, right? And he, from the same vantage point, standing in the same spot, recreated photographs, but not with live people, of course, but now with his own portraiture and imagery sitting there. And so this kind of, you know, remarkable moment of, I will go to exactly that place. I will reclaim the meaning of that place.
Amazing.
I will capture a portrait drawn from our own times with our own tools of today and put it in that place. And then I will make an image of all of that and let you digest that, right? His medium is the camera, but that's essentially exactly what our two panelists do as well, right? Sometimes literally in a case like Amistad, and you're walking across the New Haven Green. And Claudia, I don't know if there's a particular poem you wanted to read from or share today, but I think, you know, so much of what is memorable when you've read Citizen a few times, as I have, because it is kind of it is hypnotically written. Different moments, different places, even different stories in the memory begin to merge, right? But you do root things in place. You do root things in that asphalt parking lot where the body was run over, right? And I don't know if there's anything in particular from the book that you'd like to read that speaks to this, or
I'm afraid.
you're afraid to get it. Let's bring the bag over here.
Oh, there it
here's
is.
one right here.
Okay, Madeline has it. Here we go.
We've got one. Thank you.
Thank you.
A well-read citizen.
A well-read citizen. So a poem of place. The new therapist specializes in trauma counseling. You have only ever spoken on the phone. Her house has a side gate that leads to a back entrance she uses for patients. You walk down a path bordered on both sides with deer grass and rosemary to the gate, which turns out to be locked. At the front door, the bell is a small round disc that you press firmly. When the door finally opens, the woman standing there yells at the top of her lungs, "Get away from my house! What are you doing in my yard?" It's as if a wounded Doberman Pinscher or a German Shepherd has gained the power of speech. And though you back up a few steps, you manage to tell her you have an appointment. You have an appointment? She spits back. Then she pauses. Everything pauses. "Oh," she says, followed by, "Oh yes, that's right, I'm sorry, I am so, so sorry."
I want to make sure that we allow a little bit of time either for questions or just reflections from the room. Let's start right here. We got a microphone coming, so.
Just in your book, really, I was just the small things in life that a person of color, a person of oppression will experience and has experienced. That's what the book really brought out for me. Like, wow, microaggressions build up into macroaggressions, or maybe macroaggressions all add up, and you just PTSD from racism, from sexism, from anything that you feel. More so, were those examples your experience? Or were they just experiences of friends? Because, like, I feel like those are issues of many people. But if one person has truly experienced all of these, that's like undeniable proof that it's not just a coincidence.
Well, many of the examples, I could have found, I think, many examples to fill the book, but from my own life. But one of the things I wanted to do was make the book a community document. And so I asked people to tell me stories where they were interacting with a colleague, a friend, or they were doing something very ordinary. And then suddenly, racism stepped in and threw both parties out. And then the dance of, potential recognition had to be in play. In that piece I just read, the woman who told me that is a professor in Northern California. And I said to her, "So after you left, what did what happened?" And she said, "Well, I went home and I wept." And I said, "And then what happened?" And then she said, "Well, I wrote a letter to the therapist saying I couldn't come back." And I said, "But you made another appointment?" And she said, "Yeah, because you do the next thing." It wasn't, even as I was incredulous, I also knew that it probably in a position where somebody said to me, "So do you want to make another appointment?" I'd be like, I wouldn't want to hurt their feelings. They're like, "Yeah, sure." So I wanted to make it open, because I also was curious as to what kinds of things had happened to others. I mean, I knew what had happened to me over the course of 50 years of my life, but what stories would I get if I looked, if I asked? And so it was a very conscious decision.
Other questions or reflections?
I just wanted to point out the casualty and the racist remarks that were made. So, a lot of the stories that were in there were very casual, and they were very sort of like it could be in a conversation and then it would just pop up, and I love it because it's not like a normal race story where it has to be very in your face and very obviously racist, and it can be anything. It could easily happen, and it's happened to me and a lot of people I know where it's Maybe you shouldn't say that, but like you're very like iffy about it because you don't know, and it's really interesting how you like pivoted on like that. Yeah.
One of the things that I'm struck by in going back and forth between your works in preparing for today, and even, Elizabeth, within your works between poetry and prose, even though The Light of the World is not explicitly about race and the topics we're talking about here in exactly the way we're talking about here, there's that same sense where you're taking something so difficult, death, sudden death of a dear loved one, and beholding it from all of these different angles of refraction, right? In different places, in different times. And sometimes, like that last statement, it's the big thing hits you. The big thing hits you hard, just like you would have expected to in a time of grief. And other times, it's when you are in the everyday flow of everyday life in a conversation. And, you know, I guess is it the same set of antennae? Is it simply human awareness and awakeness and sensitivity? Or is the accumulation of living through these questions of American identity and race give you a particular set of antennae that are sort of labeled, these are my race antennae, right? And here's how I'm reading situations that are about race. And I'm reading them in a different way than I might read situations about family or grief or something else. I'm just curious how that was.
Well, yeah, to answer it backwards, I mean, I think, you know, understanding history, but also human perception is human perception. And I think that in a way, part of what Citizen brings out for us is you don't always know when you're stepping into the race doo-doo, you know? I mean, like sometimes you're just going to the therapist to get your own broke head fixed, right? Not even about, you know, being a black woman, just, you know, could do a little talking.
Right.
And suddenly you're in 350 years of history. Suddenly you're in, you know, all of these calcified perceptions that are you know, at the atomic level, and that are so ignorant. You know, I mean, that's what's really terrifying to me too, is about just sort of, you know, the ignorance that means that we don't see a human other. I think that I've been thinking a lot as we've been talking about the phrase bear witness, you know, and about art bearing witness, and, you know, with craft and with care saying, you know, here, I'm going to craft, these things happened, and then you hear or read, and then you feel like, yes, I understand. The bearing witness, I felt very lucky actually to have tools with which to move through extreme grief, tools of observation. What's happening? Well, I can bear witness to this, and maybe it won't fix everything, but it's a way of moving through.
You know, I want to acknowledge a larger connection here, which is the forms of bearing witness. Well, there are many forms of bearing witness, and some are forms of popular culture. Some are not about words, but are about images. But some of the most potent forms, and the poets in the room know this, it's why they are poets, are forms of bearing witness that are forced through limitations of structure, right? We have with us our friend Michelle Norris, who created a thing many of you have heard of or participated in called the Race Card Project, right? 6 words. Tell a story, bear witness on your perception on something having to do with race or an experience in 6 words, period. Put it on a card, submit, right? And the limitations, the severe limitations of that form are of a piece with the limitations that you both play with and work with and use and push against, and the limitations that our Aspen young poets have been doing all their young careers and lives. And we really wanted to make sure that this session did not end without us hearing in a formal way from the young voices we have here gathered today. And I know they've been working together on a piece that will speak in some ways to the topics we've been talking about. And I wanted to invite you all to just stand up and please share with us your work.
Everybody can see you, face out. Some kind of order appropriately.
This is exciting. They're so cute.
Can you see? Okay.
Yeah.
Do we have to use the microphone?
Yes, so that it can be recorded.
So good afternoon. I'm Ashley Gong. I'm from Connecticut, and I'm here with the National Student Poets Program, which for anyone unfamiliar with it is a signature initiative by the President's Committee on the Arts and the Humanities and the Institute of Museum and Library Services and the Alliance for Young Artists and Writers. And each year, these three partners come together to select 5 high school students from across the nation to serve as national literary ambassadors, spreading poetry as an important important means of creative expression. And we've had the huge honor of being here with the Young Chicago authors. If you want to briefly introduce it, then I'll go back to it.
Yeah, 5 of us here are also from Chicago with the Young Chicago Authors. And Young Chicago Authors runs the largest poetry festival in the world called Louder Than a Bomb, in which we all participate in slam poetry through our schools and come together as a community of poets to just share work and compete with that.
And as Damien briefly mentioned before, for the past few days, we've been engaging in various seminars centered around the theme leadership, the arts, and the good society, where we've pretty much been wrestling with questions such as what entails a good leader, what is justice or injustice, and how can we as citizens of this world create positive change, big or small, in our own communities to create this sort of better society. And one of the texts that we've been reading is Chimamanda, I hope they pronounce Adichie's work, The Danger of a Single Story, which talks about the danger and harm in perpetuating or buying into a single story, or rather stereotype, about a person or place. So inspired by this, we all squared off into partners, and we shared the single story or stereotype that we believe other people may have about us. And then afterwards, we wrote a haiku about the single story that other people have about our own selves, and then a couplet about a single story that our partner, or that someone may have about our partner. And then at the end of this, we all convened and came together, and we pieced together our haikus and couplets into a form of poetry, a Japanese form called the ranga, which starts with a haiku, then goes to a couplet, haiku, couplet, and so on. And so we'll be performing this for you right now, and we hope you all enjoy it.
One note, we didn't note who comes after you, so when you need the mic, just signal. So we know who has to. I know stories you couldn't guess, broken and small, but who comes to ask?
This child's been named Bitterness, but at home the lights are on.
Am I small to you? Skin stretched over skeleton? I'm not small to me.
Stiff as muscle in Tdap, stale face of God or a wrench.
Foster child she is, how can she find happiness? Must have had it rough.
Bet she loves math and science, she more than sad victim sound.
26 graves lie here, but this town is a town, not an artifact.
I'm a black Muslim, but not fasting, already too starved.
Polish my halo. If you think me writing God, I am atheist.
I bet you see an Ant-Man. I could swear you think you God.
My melanin fades as my religion is known. They forget I'm man.
Don't say that she speaks Mexican when you speak ignorance.
I am not your dog. I don't mind my shadow. I like my words. I do.
Yeah, I know where to get it. Do you know how to get me?
Bubble gum and bobby pins, pressed flower body, defenseless as cake.
You call me a dog, but you keep silent my Toy Story.
Under predator, a language of love choked by imposed desire.
His bleached skin made prominent, discarding his helping hand.
Hairy arm mustache girl, parents still got no papers. More papers am I.
Face the same struggle as you. My love is as free as yours.
Thank you.
Wow.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to the Aspen Young Poets. Please join me in thanking Elizabeth Alexander and Claudia Rankine for this conversation. And I just want us to remember here, as so many of the arts experiences at Ideas Festival often do, this will stay with you for a lot longer than you think. And I invite you to carry it and spread it with others. The phrase that Claudia used about her own book, a breathing document. That poem itself was a breathing document. This conversation today is a breathing document. And we have to just keep on breathing it together and telling a new story together. So thank you so much. Please join me in thanking our poet panelists.
And thank you. Thank you, Eric.